Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I start by thanking the Honourable Member for Camberwell and Peckham for raising this very important issue. 35 years in this place, and she's trying to take society forward in a leap. Can I also thank you, Mr. Speaker, for your statement and welcome the Leader of the House's statement, and to thank her for sight of her statement beforehand. We on the opposition Labour Party are ready to work with the government and all parties. The Leader of the Opposition made a statement at the weekend saying that committing the Labour Party to do such a thing. We all need to come up with an appropriate safeguarding policy for everyone who works in this place. And the Prime Minister mentioned in her letter to you, Mr. Speaker, that there may have to be a new body. Any new body has to encompass everyone who works in the House. A body that can look at complaints about members, the staff of the House, including contractors on the estate, and with members of the other place, and work with trade unions, who certainly helped the Labour Party to draw up our code of conduct. There must be due process. Any allegations must be made, and there is a proper process of investigation. Some may be referred to the police if they are serious allegations. If there is a streamlined process, then everybody is aware of it. I know the House currently has the Employee Assistant Programme, which was set up by you, Mr. Speaker, in 2014 for member staff who have a free confidential phone line, but it needs to go further. The new body needs to build on that, and I know the Leader of the House made a number of recommendations. I would say that needs to be looked at by a working party or another body so that we ensure that we don't react but deal with it appropriately. So could I ask the Leader if she can make sure that the House looks at widening the scope of this helpline to include independent advice, including legal advice on the next steps for the complainant? Because all that helpline can currently do now is to give counselling for the claimants and then refer the matter to parties. And I'm not clear what other parties do, Mr. Speaker, but the position with the opposition Labour Party is that we have a code of conduct that is signed up by every single member of the party. That's MPs and members of the party. This has been sent round a number of times since I was first elected in 2010, and I know it's been sent round again today. So that if anyone wants to raise anything under the code of conduct, it says that the matter is referred to the head of complaints of the Labour Party, who will look at the nature of the complaint. Could I also turn to and ask the Leader of the House, as the Prime Minister is here, to the letter that was sent to the Prime Minister, if she's seen the letter from the honourable friend, my honourable friend, the Shadow Minister for Women and Equalities, who has written to the Prime Minister. Could the Leader ensure that those issues where a minister has broken the ministerial code, that the person was actually a minister at the time? And could the Prime Minister's response be placed in the library? Mr. Speaker, it is not acceptable now in society where women are not treated equally, even when we do the same work. It is not acceptable that names for women's anatomy are used as swear words. And it is not acceptable that every time unacceptable behaviour is challenged, it is closed down as political correctness. I know all of us, every single one of us, on all sides of the House, will use our strength and our experience to protect the vulnerable.
Leader of the House.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I absolutely share the Honourable Lady's concerns, and I was very pleased when we met earlier today that we are absolutely in the same place in terms of a determination to tackle this issue very quickly. In specific response to her particular issues, yes, I think she's right that the House does need to look at broadening the resources available to the helpline so that staff in this place can get better support and more advice. I can tell the Honourable Lady that my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, hasn't yet seen a letter from the Opposition Women and Equalities spokesman, but she will look at that very carefully, of course. And then I do share the Honourable Lady's concern about the way in which women's anatomy is referred to as a swear word. It's exactly right. It's deeply frustrating and irritating for women and men. But I also think we must recognise that this issue doesn't just affect women, it also affects men. And so, you know, in dealing with the problems across both houses, we need to have respect for all people, women and men. Thank you.
In echoing the Shadow Leader, I should just congratulate the Right Honourable and Learned Lady, the member for Camberwell and Peckham, because I think she marked and I hope celebrated the 35th anniversary of her election to the House on October the 28th. It's a very remarkable achievement. Mrs. Maria Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I welcome the statement that my right honourable friend, the Leader of the House, has made today, and particularly the leadership shown by the Prime Minister on this issue. Can I welcome the idea of an independent grievance procedure for everybody who works in this place. But can I also gently remind members here today that 2/3 of girls in our schools experience sexual harassment on a regular basis, that half of university students experience sexual harassment, that half of women in work experience sexual harassment. So could I ask the Leader of the House what more support she might be able to give to debates on those issues in this place and encouraging the government to take action? And Mr. Speaker, you'll be aware of the fact that the member for Yardley Central, Birmingham Yardley, and I are holding a debate in the Chamber on Thursday on the issue of sexual harassment in schools.
Leader of the House.
My right honourable friend raises an incredibly important point, which is really just highlights that what we do in this House sets a role model and an example to those out in the rest of the country, and in particular at a time when we are so concerned about sexual harassment in schools. It is a pretty poor show if we can't sort out our own house. So I think my right honourable friend raises an incredibly important point.
Pete Wishart.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I very much welcome the statement from the Leader of the House, and indeed your statement, Mr. Speaker, which helpfully makes a positive way forward. And can we say we support any call for a whole House response to this and the establishment of an independent grievance procedure? Sexual harassment or abuse in any form and in any workplace must be condemned in the strongest possible terms, and this House is no exception to that. The Scottish National Party, of course, agrees that we must adopt a zero-tolerance approach. And we will be ensuring that in the Scottish Parliament, any issue will be robustly investigated. And the First Minister today has written to the presiding officer of the Scottish Parliament in regard to this. So can I ask the Leader of the House to confirm and perhaps tell us a little bit more about her plans to involve all the parties in this House? And could perhaps tell us how these talks could maybe be progressed? And does she agree that all staff working on the estate must have access to information, impartial advice and a means of raising these concerns, and a safe space is at this point created so that any concerns can be raised confidentially right now, immediately after the statement? And finally, does she agree that this is a watershed moment for this House? This is an opportunity for an institutional shift where the historic culture of this House can positively be tackled, and that there must be no suggestion that this House considers itself above any investigation.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Gentleman for his contribution. He asks what plans there are to involve all parties, and obviously this is all very recent news, and it's vital that we tackle it very urgently, and so there will be meetings arranged between all parties in the very near future, I mean within days, to make sure that we're all agreed on a common approach. He's absolutely right that all staff must have suitable information and a safe space. I do urge people, if they have allegations or if they feel that they have been made to feel uncomfortable, that they do come forward and speak to either my office or perhaps to their whip or to your office, Mr. Speaker, and it is absolutely essential that people feel they have somewhere to go. And he's right to point out that, again, that the employee helpline must be more widely communicated to staff, and we will see that that is the case. He finally makes the point that this is an opportunity for Parliament to show that we can react quickly to problems and take a quantum leap forward in our approach to dealing with this terrible issue, and I like to think that we can and will do just that.
Nicky Morgan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I first of all pay tribute to the Leader of the House and also the Prime Minister for grappling with this issue so very swiftly. The Leader of the House talked about this being a modern workplace, And isn't that the rub? Because this isn't a modern workplace, it's a very strange workplace. It's strange for members, it's strange for our families, but most of all, it's very strange for those members of staff. And you, Mr. Speaker, hinted at that when you talked about members of Parliament being individual employers. There are 650 different employment relationships. So can I urge the Leader of the House to reflect on the fact that any new organisation, which I warmly welcome, which must be independent, needs to be nimble enough to reflect on how this place actually works, to deliver the institutional shift that the Honourable Gentleman has just talked about, and must not be like IPSA costing us £6 million a year, or rather the taxpayer £6 million a year.
My right honourable friend is absolutely right. Any new both-house body will need to be nimble, it will need to have the understanding of parliamentary procedures, and it will also need to offer good value for taxpayers' money.
Yvette Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the Leader of the House accept that in any debate on sexual harassment there is too much victim blaming that happens? There are women who are blamed for not speaking out about harassment rather than asking why they didn't. Young women we've seen who did speak out being targeted with abuse on social media. And if we're going to get the right kinds of reforms, independent reforms to processes, or the right kind of culture change, not just in this place but in institutions right across the country, there has to be a much stronger voice in those reform debates for the young women and men and the junior staff who too often end up being the victims of unacceptable abuses of power. Their voices must be heard.
Yes, the Right Honourable Lady makes a very good point that it's vital that victims feel they have a safe place to bring forward allegations and that they are not the ones who end up being blamed either for failing to come forward or for presumably making false allegations, which too often seems to be the case. And I would actually highlight the situation for my honourable friend, the member for Saffron Walden, who tried to raise some issues of allegation and herself suffered unbelievable abuse for it. It's an appalling cultural trend in this country, and it really has to stop.
Mrs. Cheryl Gillen.
Sadly, for those of us that have been in the House for some time, we know that there is nothing new about the exchanges today. And I therefore welcome both your statement, Mr. Speaker, and that of the Leader of the House and the Prime Minister's intervention. And indeed, I've agreed with all the exchanges across the House today. Can we not forget that it applies to both houses? Can we not forget that it applies to our constituency staff and people beyond here? And can I urge, as my honourable friend, the member for Broxtowe, did earlier on, can I urge the Leader of the House to come up with a timescale, because I think the matter is pressing. But in the meantime, could she also make it very clear to everybody that works within this estate or connected to this estate what the interim procedures are for those individuals that may be at the receiving end of the appalling treatment that we have been reading about in the papers?
My right honourable friend mentions the fact that any new procedure needs to cover both houses, and she's right. It needs to cover all staff working here and in our constituencies, and she's absolutely right. And she also seeks interim procedures to be clarified, which we will absolutely do. But I would just like to point out to her that my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, has absolutely gripped this issue, and whilst it may have been rumbling on for many years, I think we should all be pleased that we will be addressing it in the very near future.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome these steps to eradicate harassment from this place. But when I complained recently to an officer of Parliament who had some responsibility in this area, that I knew a number of researchers, male and female, who had been made to feel deeply uncomfortable in the Sports and Social Club here by members of Parliament, I was told that that happens in pubs all over the country. Would the Leader of the House confirm that the duty of care that we owe extends 24/7 and to every restaurant, bar and in this place?
Yeah. Well, I'm very happy to give that absolute assurance. There should be no place here on the estate or in our constituency offices where people can be abused or their allegations not taken seriously. And I can assure the Honourable Lady that I will be meeting with Lord McFall to discuss the specific issues around the Sports and Social Bar tomorrow.
Mr Bennett-Jenkins.
Speaker, can I thank you for your statement and indeed for the consensus in all the statements that have so far been made and questions raised in these exchanges. But can I just point out, we wouldn't be having these exchanges if this code, the guide to the code of conduct of the House of Commons, was actually working, and then if the machinery around this code was effective. Can I draw my right honourable friend's attention to the fact that the Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards is conducting a review of the code of conduct, and that the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee has submitted quite radical suggestions about how the code should be reformed and the machinery around it reformed, so that we spend far more time in this House as members of Parliament experiencing proper professional development and understanding the code of values at the front of this document and what they actually mean and how we should live those values as members of Parliament, rather than just concentrating on all the other pages, which are about declarations of outside earnings and members' interests and all the other stuff that seems to preoccupy the regulatory authorities of this House.
Yes, my honourable friend is absolutely right to raise the fact that there is already a code of conduct, and I'm grateful to him for sending me his committee's report on that matter over the weekend. It's certainly something I'll be looking at carefully over the next couple of days.
Kevin Barron.
Mr Speaker, much has been made in the media this weekend of the inability of the Standards Commissioner and therefore the Standards Committee to look into many of the issues raised over the last week. However, in a report debated in March 2012, the committee tried to give the Commissioner a wider scope over these issues, but an amendment tabled by the three major parties' parliamentary shop stewards and supported by the front benchers was introduced to block this, and therefore the Commissioner was left unable to look into these very important issues. When the Standards Committee reforms shortly, we will again be looking at the Code of Conduct, and I hope that all parties in here will be a lot more receptive to necessary changes.
The honourable gentleman raises a really important point, and I can assure him that the Commission will meet under the chairmanship of Mr Speaker this afternoon and will be discussing these matters there.
Esther McVeigh.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm delighted to hear the Leader of the House will extend these to other forms of abuse. Will that include those MPs who go on rallies endorsing the lynching of other MPs? It is an absolute disgrace that senior MPs go about their business getting violence against female MPs.
My right honourable friend raises an incredibly important point, again, about the vital significance of what we do as MPs. And certainly slogans about lynching other MPs is incredibly despicable behaviour that is occasionally encouraged, and I think it is deeply regrettable, and we all need to look very carefully at what sort of behaviour we endorse in this House.
Jo Swinson.
Mr Speaker, sexual harassment is a problem in Parliament, as it is indeed in workplaces and schools right across the country, and it is often worst where there are big discrepancies of power. I really hope that the news reports of the last few days act as a watershed moment and help to catalyse the change that we so clearly need, not least in the outdated attitudes that exist still in some quarters. I welcome the cross-party agreement that we need an independent reporting mechanism for investigating complaints. But will the Leader of the House agree that if people are to have confidence in using it, that the process needs to be very clearly set out, as indeed do the outcomes need to be? Because repercussions in secret via the usual channels will not cut it in 2017.
Well, the Honourable Lady has been a big champion for women over several years, and I applaud her for that. She's absolutely right. What the grievance procedure will need to do is to be very clear, very well communicated, and with very clearly established and set out principles about how the grievance procedure escalates, with very clear so what now results at the end of it, that everybody who participates in it can see for themselves.
Shailesh Vara.
Speaker, urgency, of course, is very important in how we deal with this issue. But nevertheless, would the Leader of the House confirm that this isn't going to be something that will be dealt with simply by House officials and those working in the Palace of Westminster, but that best practice will be utilised and that advice will be sought from external organisations as to how they deal with this, because we need to get this right first time round.
Well, I think vital will be cross-party agreement and working closely with your office, Mr Speaker. And of course, the House officials themselves do have some expertise in this area, but all ideas will be welcomed. But bearing in mind, as a number of members have said, that this is a very unusual workplace.
Jess Phillips.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I would obviously welcome what has been said here today and look forward to working with you on the reference group on this issue going forward. As I walked in here, as I rushed in here today to come to this statement, I overheard two male colleagues walking through the halls wittering about a witch hunt that was going on in Parliament. So I think that what we need to do in this building is not think of this as being a party political thing, but something that has to absolutely happen. And we don't just cheer when our own side is the person getting attacked. We cheer when everybody is bound to rights. I want to ask the Leader of the House if she would touch a little bit, and she didn't when she outlined what she felt and that the government felt needed to be done, what she felt needed to happen to perpetrators of this crime. Because the fact of the matter is that good referral lines, support for victims is obviously something that I support, but nothing hurts a victim more than watching a perpetrator getting away with it.
Well, she's exactly right, and I certainly welcome her desire for a non-partisan approach to resolution of this. It affects all sides of the House, and we do need to work together on it. In terms of what happens to the perpetrators, that is, of course, a matter for the House to debate, but it will include, where they are staff who are perpetrating, then the normal contractual potential for losing your job. Where it's an MP, then the possible withdrawal of the whip or sacking of ministers and so on. All of these well-known events that can happen from time to time must be in scope and will be in scope.
Anne Main.
Mr Speaker, and I very much welcomed your inclusion in your speech about bullying and other forms of harassment. Can I say that also sometimes victims are not empowered to speak up and make a complaint? Can we also make sure that there can be potentially a form of a reporting, because other people can observe harassment and bullying within an office place and feel that they could alert someone's attention to it?
Yes, I think if we can establish a proper grievance procedure, then it should be perfectly possible to report observed behaviour and not just personal experience.
Lucy Powell.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and can I welcome your statements and the statements that have been made today. As others have said, this is nothing new. This comes about because of a political culture of preferment where people can't speak about what has happened to them for fear of their career being stifled. And in order to change that political culture, it requires all of us to take very strong political leadership. And I say this to the political leaders on both sides and all sides of the House. That means taking decisions against colleagues and others, even when that is inconvenient, even when that is against their own allies or their own supporters on their own side. And that requires strong leadership. Does she agree with me?
I absolutely agree with the Honourable Lady.
Rachel McLean.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And I also welcome the statements and comments that have been made today. I was speaking to my own researcher just early this week, and she herself highlighted some of the experiences that she has had in this place. And as a new MP, I definitely find that shocking and unacceptable. Can I highlight the importance in the code of education, both for staff themselves and also for us as members? Many of the members who come in here have not had the experience of employing people before. We need to be kept up to date with what is happening in society. What does constitute harassment? We may think those are innocent phrases, but they are not perceived as such. And our staff also need to be empowered completely to bring forward complaints. Does she agree with me?
I think my honourable friend raises a really important and thoughtful point, which is that very often members who haven't had experience of employing staff before coming to this place do themselves need some guidance, and I think that could be a very useful contribution as a result of this experience.
Liz Saville-Roberts.
A worker employed as staff of a member in this House told me today that she reported being sexually assaulted to the proper authorities earlier this year, who did nothing. She is deeply disappointed and distrustful, and she tells me that distrust is endemic. How can I assure her that her complaint would now be treated differently?
Well, what I can say to the Honourable Lady is that if her staffer would like to talk to me about it, then I will certainly take it up personally.
Nusrat Ghani.
Mr. Speaker, I welcome my right honourable friend's statement, sending a clear message that sexual harassment is never acceptable. And who would have thought that as we celebrate the centenary of women getting the vote, that we have to address in this chamber the conduct and language that intimidates and controls women in particular. This is about the abuse of power and the status of women. I welcome the cross-party agreement to stamp this out, especially as we are all working in a climate where women across the House are being abused just for being in public office. Perhaps we can start by referring to the Code of Conduct. I know I raised this with the Minister last week in Business Questions, that with the privilege of being elected comes a duty, and that doesn't involve sexist language and behaviour, because all of us elected know the power that we hold.
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and I deeply regret the horrible experience she's had in recent weeks for merely trying to raise her own disgust at sexual harassment that was going on.
Liz Kendall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Parliament must act, but all political parties must act too. Does the Leader of the House agree that every party should introduce independent reporting so that women have the confidence to come forward, not just in Parliament, but in local councils and our party activist base too?
Well, I think the Honourable Lady raises a really interesting point, which I will certainly take away and think about. But my perspective on this is that we need independent review, because the problem with parties marking their own homework is always that in itself creates an underlying lack of confidence on the part of victims. And so I think that independent review, that third-party professional view, is going to be very important in resolving this.
Michael Fabricant.
The Honourable Lady, the member for East Dunbartonshire, was quite right to talk about confidence, because there needs to be confidence in the system, and that's why it needs to be an independent body, because justice must not only be done, it must be seen to be done. But may I also say that although the Honourable Lady talked about witch hunts, we've got to be very careful to avoid them. And one of the advantages of there being an independent body was that it will avoid just that. There will have to be proper, substantiated allegations to be made.
Yes, my honourable friend is right. What we don't want to see is false allegations made and then becoming a fact just as made. So the absolutely proper investigation is essential to get to the bottom of the allegations and find out whether they're true or not.
Stella Creasy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for your leadership on this issue. I think we need to be clear here that we're not just talking about issues that are criminal. We're also talking about making sure a culture of sexual violence, harassment and misogyny, and not believing those who come forward, is not considered the norm. And to do that means being clear about what happens not just to those who come forward, but those who participate.
So I would like to hear from the Leader of the House a bit more clarity, and following up my colleagues from Leicester and my colleague from Birmingham Yardley, about what measures she's expecting political parties to take to make sure that we don't just keep employees and volunteers safe from illegal activities, but we also protect them from a constructive dismissal case. Or is it simply that we're going to expect the electorate to pick up the slack?
Well, I think I've been perfectly clear, firstly, that the issue is around those who are made to feel uncomfortable. I'm absolutely setting the bar significantly below criminal activity. If people are made to feel uncomfortable, then that is not correct. In terms of the consequences for the perpetrators, I think I've also been perfectly clear. In the case of staff, they could forfeit their jobs. In the case of members of Parliament, they could have the whip withdrawn and they could be fired from ministerial office.
Mims Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If we don't call out bad behaviour, irresponsible or criminal behaviour, which we do weekly in our constituency surgeries, then we are all part of the problem. The Right Honourable Lady opposite raised this question rightly and uses her gravitas to highlight these issues. And I have the pleasure of serving on your Diversity Committee to look at these issues. We've been making some great strides forward on making this a positive workplace for all. Can I ask the Leader and the Prime Minister to work with me and all members from all parties to make sure that we have a strong voice in all the separate issues, whether it is misogyny, poor language or indeed criminal behaviour, that we do everything to give public confidence in every single party.
My honourable friend has been a great champion of treating others with respect, and I would be personally delighted to work with her on this.
John Mann.
Speaker, will all cases that have been reported and not actioned, which is not just the one in North Wales, but others, will they be reopened? Will there be the right of anybody who's been sexually assaulted to say, no, I don't want the issue to go to the police, I want it treated in other ways? In other words, will the victim control what the action is? Will there be compulsory training on the implications of the duty of care under the Equality Act immediately brought in for all MPs? And where someone wishes to have trade union representation to assist them, will that be allowed?
The honourable gentleman raises some really important and very sensible ideas, and I will look very carefully at all of those. I do again urge anybody who's been made to feel uncomfortable or who feels that they've been improperly treated to come forward, and those issues will be taken up through the right channels, which, until we have a proper independent grievance policy and a group of people able to take that up, then the existing policies of the employee helpline, which can be expanded, and my offer that people could come to me personally, will absolutely be appropriate ways to take things forward.
And Dr. Matthew Offord.
Just gently remind the House that this issue isn't just about sexual harassment, and it isn't just about women. The issue of bullying in this House is systemic. Earlier today, I received a text from someone when he described a problem that he saw in this place, and he spoke of him as a current member. He is utterly foul, and I'm sure it's a pattern of behaviour on his part. But in this instance, I don't think it would be fair on the woman in question to name him. Still, he says, do the best you can to widen this to bullying and treating your staff like, and I think he's put dirt. But can I say, Mr. Speaker, or can I say to the Leader of the House, can I ask her to widen this to not only include issues of bullying, but also historical allegations?
Well, it is absolutely the intention that this review looks at all issues of misdemeanour and misconduct, including sexual harassment and bullying and other forms of uncomfortable behaviour that is perpetrated on members of staff in this place.
Chris Bryant.
When I was a curate in the Church of England 30 years ago, one of my very close colleagues confided in me that he had been raped by a very senior member of the Church of England clergy. My friend was understandably terrified about telling anybody, telling the police or anybody else that this was the truth. in the end, and he felt suicidal. He didn't want others to know what had happened to him. Quite understandably, he was the victim, not the perpetrator. Now, I make absolutely no criticism of my friend. The senior cleric concerned had a great deal of protection from the establishment, including from certain members in the royal family, and he subsequently, thank God, went to prison. The Church's instinct was to protect itself as the institution. And isn't that always the danger? But isn't the one thing that we must learn from all of this, that the best way to protect the institution is actually to protect the victims? Yeah. Put our own house in order. And can I just make one tiny suggestion, which is that any time an MP interviews somebody for a new job, they have somebody from HR, an HR professional, sitting alongside them in the interview.
Well, I think the honourable gentleman raises a really terrible case and, absolutely horrifying. And he's right to point out that the victim should not be the one to suffer in the way that his friend obviously did. I think the point he raises is a very important one, that we do need to ensure that this is not the House protecting itself, but that it is Parliament protecting all of those who come here to work and try to make their country a better place.
To Philip Oliver.
Congratulate the Right Honourable Lady, the member for Camberwell and Peckham, for asking this urgent question, and to the Leader of the House for her response. May I ask how many calls have been made to the confidential helpline up to now? And if we are to really get rid of this unacceptable behaviour, wouldn't a good place to start to be to contact those who've contacted the confidential helpline to see how their cases might be taken forward now?
Leader of the House.
Well, I say to my honourable friend that on the Employee Assistance Programme, it is intended as a safety net to complement the existing pastoral care and internal processes put in place by MPs themselves and the main political parties. In response to his specific question about how many calls have been made to it, I don't know, but I can find out and put that in the library.
Luciana Berger.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When I visit one of the schools in my constituency, as we often do as MPs, I'm required to sign in, and I'm made aware of the safeguarding policies each and every time. While I recognise that Parliament isn't exactly the same as a school, I am concerned that there are often visitors brought onto this estate, often who are here socialising late at night, who must also be held responsible too. Can I ask the Leader of the House how she will ensure that this is a safe place for all, by all of the time?
Well, the Honourable Lady raises another different but equally very important point, which is the safety and protection of those who come onto the estate. It's something that I'm actually looking at carefully, and as I mentioned earlier to her honourable friend, I will be meeting with Lord McFall tomorrow to discuss exactly how we protect those who come onto the estate in order to socialise, often quite late at night.
Mr. Peter Heaton-Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I came to this place after some years working for the BBC, an institution which in itself has had its challenges in this area. And with that experience, I want to endorse what the Leader of the House and you yourself, Mr. Speaker, have said about the importance of this institution having a robust procedure. It must not be left to individual components thereof, be that individual employers or political parties. It is this institution, Parliament, that has to have this robust governance procedure. And can I say that there are a few categories of people that I think specifically this process must be sufficiently fleet of foot to be able to help. The first is those members of staff who work in our constituency offices, who do often feel isolated and vulnerable. And the second is students, and they are often students who come here on work experience or to do internships. And I would like to suggest that whenever a student, an intern, someone on a work placement begins, there should be, as part of a very basic induction process, a very simple instruction as to this is where you go if at any time you feel vulnerable. I think that's lacking at the moment.
Yes, my honourable friend is right. I think some of us do have clear guidelines for very often quite young people coming to this place for work experience, and something that we can all give to those young people to give them some reassurance is an extremely good idea.
Dr. Philippa Whitford.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I think across the House what we recognise is that this is a fault of undiluted power. When someone holds your entire future in their hand, it is very difficult to refuse or to speak out. While it's sexual abuse and sexual harassment that has brought this to the attention today, it is also misogyny, dismissal and gender discrimination. And it isn't just here. Here needs to start the change, but in the law, in the NHS, in any hierarchical system, we need to see change.
Yes, I think the Honourable Lady is right that it starts at the top, and if those in power abuse those beneath them, then it does create a culture where actually abuse becomes endemic right throughout the system. So I wouldn't say that it's only from the top, but it is certainly that's where it starts, and that's where leadership needs to be taken.
Tim Lawton.
Mr. Speaker, those of us who've been in this place long enough to have seen the expenses scandal will have seen how that long, drawn-out process, often subject to apparent obfuscation by this place, was deeply damaging to the integrity of not only this institution, but every member of it, by implication, despite how innocent they might have been. So does the Leader of the House agree with me that it is absolutely essential that to tackle this problem, it needs to be swift, robust, and wholly transparent, because we send out a message to the way the rest of society happens, and all of us, however innocent, have a duty to play in that.
Yes, my honourable friend is exactly right, and it is absolutely our intention that we will make very swift progress on this within days. He's right to point out that cross-party there is agreement that this needs to be resolved, and I think if we all work together we'll be able to do that.
Adrian Bailey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for your statement and the Leader of the House for her very forthright statement. The Leader of the House said earlier that this was an issue that didn't just focus on Westminster, it applied to politics across the country. In my own local authority, very recently, 2 female councillors have been abused in a most sexually derogatory manner online, initiated by a fellow councillor. Could I ask the Leader of the House to have conversations with their colleagues in community and local government to ensure that the same robust policies and procedures that she's outlining for this House apply equally to local government, councillors and staff?
Yes, the honourable gentleman raises a very important point, and my right honourable friend, the DCLG Secretary of State, would be very happy to meet with him and discuss this specifically.
Dr. Lisa Cameron.
Many thanks, Mr. Speaker, and I welcome today the cross-party approach that has been discussed. As a doctor coming into the House, I was quite concerned from the constituency experience to find that no disclosure checks are mandatory for staff in the constituency office, although these checks are quite rigorous in terms of those working in Parliament. Would the Leader of the House agree that it's important that staff are kept safe right across the board, and that also we have a duty to protect constituents?
Well, that is a very interesting point that the Honourable Lady raises, and I will certainly look into it.
Louise Haigh.
For the House to my record in the Register of Interests. You and many other members, Mr. Speaker, have mentioned the fundamental imbalance between parliamentary staff and our staff as members. Parliamentary staff have one employer, they are members of a recognised trade union if they wish to be, but there is a very active and well organised trade union representing member staff, I know because I used to be branch secretary of it. So could I ask you, Mr. Speaker, and the Leader of the House, if you would be willing to meet with that union in order to discuss recognition, which is not without precedence?
Well, I can't speak for you, Mr. Speaker, but I'm certainly be very happy to meet with them.
Similarly, I am very happy to meet, and I look forward to hearing from the Honourable Lady. There should be an opportunity for a troika or a quartet or maybe something larger, I don't know, but it is important and should happen sooner rather than later. Chris Stevens.
Mr. Speaker, many employers, as well as having an independent grievance procedure, actually have a standalone independent bullying and harassment policy, in which any complaints of bullying and harassment are dealt with separately under a different procedure. So can I ask the Leader of the House if that is being explored, a separate bullying and harassment policy, and does she agree with me that trade unions now, if they have any members of staff coming to them with complaints, that trade unions should be invited to make those complaints to the Speaker and the Leader of the House.
Yeah. Leader of the House.
Well, I'm certainly aware as a constituency MP myself that some trades unions have done excellent work in protecting their members from bullying at work, and that is a vital role that they fulfil. My inclination in terms of how we go about resolving our own house issues is that we should have a two-house solution, and that should be an independent grievance procedure where anybody can bring any allegations, whether of bullying, intimidation, sexually inappropriate behaviour and so on, rather than having separate streams of activity.
Liz McInnes.
Speaker, can I ask the Leader of the House if she will give some consideration to providing assertiveness training for staff so that they might be better equipped to decide for themselves what constitutes good-humoured hijinks and what constitutes sexual harassment?
Yeah, here. Yes, the Honourable Lady raises a very good point, and I certainly would be very supportive of that. There often are courses that are made available, and individual members can choose to send staff on them. I myself have sent staff on assertiveness training. Equally, I think another honourable member has raised the issue of training for members of Parliament on how to treat their staff. I think that equally has merit, and certainly all of these things should be up for discussion.
Mr. Gavin Robinson.
Much, Mr. Speaker, and in adding the support of members of this bench to the cross-party focus that there has been this afternoon, could I urge a note of caution to the Leader and maybe ask for a bit of clarity? There was a promise earlier for a completely confidential reporting mechanism. Can I assume that that is solely focused on a lack of reporting or publication of the name of a victim? Because I can't see how you could proceed with a full allegation through to the accused without revealing the identity of the victim.
Yes, I understand the point the Honourable Gentleman is making, and what I was suggesting was that it should be possible for the accuser to remain anonymous, at least in the early stages, because all too often people have been afraid of coming forward for fear of their name being all over the front pages of the newspapers.
Gavin Shuker.
Mr. Speaker, in reflecting on the comments of my honourable friend from Leicester West, would she also take into account that if we make a step forward here in Westminster, it actually further perpetuates the gap in terms of protection between people that work in this place and our wider political constituencies, in other words, the culture of our political parties, where we have a real duty of care to those activists, and where actually bullying, intimidation, and other forms of bad behaviour can often spread very easily against a culture where political parties seek to shut allegations down rather than bringing them into the light.
Leader of the House.
Yes, the Honourable Gentleman's right to raise this point, and it's certainly something that I would hope, if we can show leadership in this place, we will then be able to tackle the wider ramifications throughout the country.
Gavin Newlands.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. I too agree with much of which has been said today, but however I find it hard to believe that other members were unaware of allegations of the kind made in recent days. The fact that things like this haven't been reported up to now not only speaks to the macho image and atmosphere of this place, but of the unwillingness of far too many men to report such behaviour. Does the Leader agree with me that those men who remain silent in some cases are just as culpable as the perpetrators, and that men in this place and elsewhere need to come forward to challenge the report abuse to stamp this out once and for all?
Well, I do urge those who feel uncomfortable, who feel that they have been abused or bullied or intimidated or harassed, to come forward. But what